Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Marketplace Risk, Key Trends for E-commerce Platforms to Watch. We're excited to have you join. My name is Megan Billingsley, and I'll be moderating today's event. We're thrilled to be joined today by Ron Teicher, President and Founder at EverC, and Matthew Smith, Director of Marketplace Strategy and Business Development at Walmart. In this presentation, Ron and Matthew will discuss the rise of marketplace risk and strategies to prevent it. To achieve this, you need to understand factors driving the phenomenon and have the capability to evaluate merchants at the product level. But before we start, I have just a few housekeeping items. Please note the slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button located in the top right corner of your presentation window. If you need technical assistance, click on the Help widget located on the bottom left corner of your console. We encourage you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your console. We will try to answer these during the webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed, or if we run out of time, it will be answered later via email. Please know we do capture all questions. After the presentation, you will also be able to access the on-demand recording of the webinar using the same link from today's live event. All right, with that out of the way, let's begin with an overview of what we'll cover during today's conversation. First, we will explain what exactly marketplace risk is and why your organization should address it. Next, we will detail why this risk can have such broad implications across an organization. Then we'll delve into why it exists and the factors inherent in marketplaces that create the risk. After that, we'll provide insight into what marketplace trends in 2023 could impact your business this year. And finally, we'll discuss strategies to prevent the risk that organizations need to address. So, Ron, before we dive into 2023 and solutions, can you first explain what marketplace risk is and how it differs from other types of risk like merchant risk?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me today. So let's start with very kind of basic definitions, though. What is a marketplace? Just to make sure we're on the same page. A common online marketplace is a digital website that aggregates multiple sellers under a single platform and allows buyers who have access to the website and that have a valid, supported physical address to purchase goods online. It's the digital equivalent to a physical marketplace, like a shopping mall. But unlike a shopping mall that hosts the different shops and receives rent from the sellers, the digital marketplace is often the one that is in charge of the payment transaction, and in many times serves as the familiar front to the purchase, where the actual seller's identity is not always very visible. This has a lot of commercial benefits for the marketplace, but along with it, it carries a higher responsibility towards the buyers. It was already ruled in U.S. courts, I think it was in an Amazon case, that the marketplace cannot be considered as a pipe or merely as a sales enablement infrastructure, but it has a responsibility towards the buyers, even though the direct seller is a different entity. The risk to the marketplace is therefore sellers abusing the platform to sell illegal and or dangerous products for the buyers that can get hurt by purchasing these goods. Unlike in merchant risk, where the merchant itself will carry most of the liability, in case of the marketplace can be liable for allowing bad sellers to sell on the platform and potentially harm the sellers.
Yeah, you said a lot there, Ron. It's good to be with you guys. And I think, when you said that question, Megan, it occurs to me that a lot of us, have seen this transition from, what Ron is saying is I think the brick and mortar, right, marketplace to something that's digital or air. And I often think of that transition as one from, a small number of large physical retailers kind of controlling access and creating scarcity, right, to a large number of platforms of all sizes, essentially having no such control. So I think it's been fascinating to watch, but I think from a risk perspective, I think there are four factors. Certainly the number of sellers, right? If you're going to try to quantify risk, the number of sellers on the platform. And then within the sellers, how much inventory, right, is in the marketplace for those sellers to bring. And then you have the marketplace piece, the platform piece, which is how many, how large, how complex are those marketplaces that those sellers can list on? And then ultimately, how well do those platforms police their own guidelines, right? And those first two, kind of swing with market demand, and we certainly saw that impact during COVID and the recovery since. But the last two, are really a function of marketplaces. How many are there, and how complex are they, and how well do they police, right, their standards? And so there's a running joke among some of the larger marketplaces that if you have 3 unique monthly users, you can start an online marketplace, and if you have 4, you can start your own retail media group. Which is not to be condescending, but it really is to say, this is really exploding, right? And so we've seen all the virtual, all the legacy retailers launching marketplaces. You see solution providers like Shopify and others, both powering those ecosystems as well as building their own offerings, which may, sooner rather than later, directly compete with some of those retail platforms as a direct portal, right? And so within that, then you see the complexity increasing, right, with the rise of multi-channel fulfillment, which means that retailers are not just fulfilling their own transactions, but they can increasingly fulfill transactions that originate on another platform, right? And so that just necessarily expands the complexity. And when you expand complexity, you increase risk. And so I think when you drill down to some specifics, we see counterfeit goods. We see those coming from maybe fly-by-night LLCs or from resellers. And, we see some specific category examples there, like electronics and apparel, or in categories like the consumable space where I work, places like, food, health, and beauty. These are very, very focused on ingredients, right? And accordingly, ingredient labeling and compliance standards, which vary widely, by the platform. And so ultimately, what we're talking about is, bad actors exploiting cracks in those rules, right, in those platforms. And so when you think about protecting against that, it requires a lot of resourcing in our trust and safety teams, in our legal teams, our compliance teams, certainly our partner operations, and then the tech and the tools to do that, in a scalable way that doesn't just require more and more human hours, because ultimately it's about detecting and then taking action upon folks that violate it.
Excellent. Thank you. I think that's a great background for our viewers today. So I do want to ask, what's the threat of this risk? How can it cause damage to the organization? Matthew, do you want to start this one?
Sure. I'll keep the mic for this one. I think it's important. We can start off by talking about compliance risk, right? Because I think it's important that you separate like intentional bad actors from those who are, otherwise good actors, but who may just require some education or some support from the marketplace in order to be compliant. I think that's a really important distinction. So on the former, the bad actors, red flags would be evidence of arbitrage. You're going to see frequently IP violations, fraudulent credentials, possibly the use of false tracking information. There are a lot of signals, and again, those cracks, right, that are being exploited. But for otherwise good intentioned sellers, right, they're not going to raise those red flags. And so those compliance risk factors are going to more often be around, again, like maybe state level regulations around shipping, right? Product ingredients for sure, right? Which also can vary, usually at the federal level, but certainly between countries. Safety standards as well. And what's important is that even when they get their ducks in a row there, they're going to face, a pretty strict sort of bar on maintaining performance, right, from a customer service perspective. And so, once they get through all those legal hurdles and compliance hurdles, we're going to monitor them to make sure that they're delivering for the customer, they're maintaining high standards in terms of like listing quality, their customer service, et cetera. And so, they're listing their products accurately, they're staying in stock, like everything that, you got to do just to show up well to the customer. That's also a form of compliance, right? And so I think there's the, worst case scenario of folks you have to defend from. And then there's a side of compliance, which is about ensuring customer, is well served. So I think it's important to sort of look at those two, under separate lenses.
Ron, any thoughts that you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about marketplace risk, I think it's predominantly to the buyers. The buyers may be harmed, by the goods that they have purchased. They may discover that the goods are fake. They may be defrauded by the sellers, etc. So the direct risk for the marketplace is the liability that the marketplace carries for any type of damage to the buyer. And of course, there is the reputational aspect. Marketplace heavily rely on trust from the buyers in order to thrive. If you're a buyer and you want to purchase anything, if the marketplace reputation plays a dramatic role in your decision to make the purchase. Any type of incident from any type of harm to a buyer through association with, I don't know, extreme groups that are selling their goods on the marketplace, through even a counterfeit, as was mentioned, may have a dramatic impact on the marketplace, and therefore the ability of the marketplace to be able to identify these issues in advance is fundamental and critical to their ability to thrive and be successful in their business. The challenge, as we'll talk about a bit more in a minute, the challenge is dramatic, right? Because as Matthew mentioned, we're talking about very large volumes of sellers with endless amount of products that are being sold, and every one of these products can ultimately cause a dramatic damage. So the controls and the precision and the speed in which these things are identified have to be on point in order to mitigate this risk and allow the marketplace to thrive.
Excellent. So clearly then the scope is a large one. So what then are the factors that drive the rise of this marketplace risk and therefore the other risks that you mentioned? Ron?
So, when we look at it, we see a number of things. One, in this day and age, it's the ease of becoming a seller. If we think about the past, if you want to become a shop owner in a mall, right, or even today, you have to go to the place, you sit down in the office, you go through a bunch of forms, you have to provide a ton of data and so forth. The marketplaces today are competing on the business of these online sellers, and are going out of the way to minimize friction in the onboarding process of these sellers. This on its own invites both the good and the bad actors to take part in the platform. So that's number one. Two, as we mentioned, it's the volume of the sellers. I always like to go back to the physical world in order for us to understand for ease of comparison, right? We think about a big mall that has hundreds of stores. Once they've been onboarded, let's say they have a turnover of a few tens of merchants a year. Then you need to onboard, I don't know, one or two new shops a year maybe, or maybe slightly more. When we're talking about online marketplaces, some of the big ones are onboarding tens of thousands of sellers a day, right? There's no way, right, in traditional means to be able to have the same thorough examination, right, of the integrity of the seller as you would do in the physical world. That, again, there's some, there has to be some sort of compromise, right? It's either going to take you longer, or you're going to have to compromise some of the checks which would then allow for the bad actors to sort of infiltrate the platform. Speed is a third factor. Again, the competition over the business of these sellers encouraging the marketplaces to try to get the sellers up and running as soon as possible. A seller would usually prefer to get up and running as quickly as possible versus, wait a couple weeks before they're being able to start operating. That creates a competition between marketplaces to speed up the onboarding process. And again, they're making some compromises on the ability to validate and authenticate everything that they could have done if they had a longer time to do that. 4 is the global nature of the activity. And this has a couple of things. One, if you're a marketplace and you're trying to operate in a new territory, obviously, you're going to have to make sure you're able to plug in to the local relevant sources that will allow you to vet these sellers. That's not an easy task. And second is the regulatory aspect of that global complexity, and it gets really, really messy, right? In terms of the matrix of regulations, right? In some cases, it's very clear cut. Something is not allowed anywhere, right? In some cases, you have things that are allowed in one place or not allowed in other places. You have a situation where you have, medicine that requires prescription in one country, but doesn't require prescription in a different country. So, you have to kind of manage this gigantic matrix of regulation in order to be able to make sure, as a marketplace, you're not exposing yourself into regulatory and compliance risk. And last, is the volume of product listings. We're talking about a volume of sellers. This problem is then compounded with the volume of listings, right? And when we're talking about the big marketplaces, some of these marketplaces, between the completely new products that are being loaded to the platform and products that are being updated, we're talking about tens of billions of products a year. And as the marketplace, you need to know about every single one of them. Because if just one of these tens of billions of products can harm somebody, and when we've seen a lot of stories in the media, people purchasing, drugs that are harmful, that are fake, exploding phones, and things of that nature that can cause real serious damage, and that could be any one of these tens of billions of products. And so, the level of precision and coverage has to be such that the marketplace can mitigate that risk, and that's very, very complicated, and contributes to the overall risk in the marketplace.
There's so much to unpack there, Ron. I mean, while Ron's talking, I'm thinking a couple of just running ideas. One is, and I think it's important for merchants or vendors, right, sellers, to keep in mind that there's a sort of unspoken or unwritten but understood trade-off here, which is, to give sellers access to those markets, right? I think you have to understand as a seller that those platforms have to sort of operate out of a posture of an assumption of guilt, right? Like all regulations, if you have your customer at the heart of what you're trying to do and protect, then, you write regulations, we write laws, based on the worst possible outcome and then kind of hope for the better, right? And so we see that even internally among, teams where, it's not accidental. It's entirely by design that, your trust and compliance and legal and safety teams, sit far away from your frontline sales teams, right? Often Sometimes we're going to err on the side of sharing less information than more, which I was thinking as we're going through this webinar, because, we can talk and talk and talk about best practices and trends, but on some level, there's a certain amount of information that platforms just can't share because they can't risk, that a seller or a merchant will find just one little morsel, of things that they can exploit in the system. And so it's really fascinating, I think, kind of push-pull and friction that's inherent in when you just talk about granting access to as many different companies as possible, right? But maybe three more, because Ron, gave us several. I see the share of brand owners sort of flattening. Away from, let's say, large holding companies, so the opportunity for a lot more brands, right? A lot smaller brands controlled by a lot more companies, right? Versus the 80s where, there were two colas in the US. Now there are literally hundreds, probably thousands of variants of those SKUs. That's great for the customer, right? Because it gives them a larger selection, more varied selection. It actually, drives prices down because you have more sellers, more brands, competing for that buy box, which is also going to drive offer quality and customer service up. But it also means that the potential cases of compliance infringement are going to go up, right? They're going to skyrocket by orders of magnitude. So that's a challenge, right? Number one. My number two would be that, Ron was talking about just speed and volume, right? Driving to the point of billions of items. I think the only way that you can really manage that is through software and increasingly AI. And so understandably, as this demand increases, we see a huge increase in the commoditization of software as a service, particularly in logistics and shipping. And that means more and more sellers can get access to the platforms, and they can get access to product from more and more areas from around the globe, right? And if you look at that side by side with the fact that now there are also more platforms available, more marketplaces to list their product on, and that more and more of those are actually in international markets, all those together drive a huge increase in cross-border trade, right? And the flow of product across borders. And so retailers have to constantly keep up and reconcile and manage now multiple different compliance policies and protocols from multiple countries, right? And so, just again, to take Ron's statement further, volume and speed times technology, right, equals a risk factor, right, that increases by orders of magnitude. And then I think on the complexity piece, I think the third factor is really with multi-channel fulfillment, where retailers, marketplaces, 3PLs, all of those actors who now have the ability to fulfill, right? And now they can do it not just for transactions originated on their own platform, but if they have inventory held in a warehouse that can fulfill a transaction from another marketplace, right, in an economical and efficient way, that's what multi-channel fulfillment is. And so for sellers, the ability to house your product in one area, physical area, to fulfill with speed across multiple channels, right? When you combine that with the increasing internationalization, right, of the compliance risk and the speed and volume that Ron spoke about, you now have marketplaces that have to do those first two, but they have to do it with an eye towards the nuances and the rules of different platforms, where there invariably, there are going to be some differences in compliance policies between these platforms. And so I don't think this is going to slow the growth of multi-channel fulfillment. I actually predict it's just going to accelerate the number and the quality of those tech solutions, right, that are going to reduce that burden, because, again, the volume and the speed that Ron was mentioning ultimately means we're already at, and we will increasingly be in a space where you can't throw enough bodies and enough, human hours at problem. And so it's exciting, thrilling, and also a bit scary.
Yeah, that's a great point. Just to kind of tag on that last point, I think, that you spoke about the multi-channel fulfillment. It's an interesting because, now obviously the sellers, but the bad actors as well, they sort of have, a multi-channel, opportunities. So, they what we would oftentimes see is these bad actors trying to come through a bunch of different avenues. And to your point about technology, another aspect, in addition to speed and volume, another important aspect is the ability to kind of be able to see these bad actors operating in all these other different places, and maybe have the ability to sort of preempt their attempt to even go in the first place, because they've already been operating somewhere else, and they already sort of tagged with that information about their activity. So just just another point there around technology. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I really think that this is such a good dialogue just about things that we need to be aware of. But I want to interject and kind of ask about counterfeits. Like, where do they fit in? How do they play a role in this? Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Ron sort of started to put down there was this idea of increasing participation and transparency from folks who have a common challenge, right? And not just among the private sector. I think we've seen a lot of important work from governments recently, because we're incentivized to protect our customers, who are the public, right? And so counterfeits, I think we're already approaching like mid 9-digit revenue, last year, or actually even before the pandemic, I believe. And then of course, we saw these massive demand spikes, in the COVID era, where products that could help, in whatever circumstances you found yourself in, right? From COVID tests, to paper towel, to, fill in the blank. But ultimately, that squeezed legitimate products, right? Because in-stocks are really hard to maintain by legitimate actors, and that just created an opening for counterfeit, right? Because the demand was wide open, right? And we were probably a little more lenient and liberal just generally, because we were going to err on the side of getting really critical goods and services, to people that needed them. And so, so that's the trend, and COVID definitely added fuel to the fire. I think there may be two efforts that are underway that can maybe slow the trend. I think the the ICA that was passed recently had very, very strict guidelines and scrutiny on seller businesses, and particularly on the information that a marketplace will make available about a business to the end user, right, to the customer. And I think, we're all familiar with sort of the old days, right, of certain large marketplaces where, service levels, return policies, customer service, et cetera, was different for some products than others. And, maybe only more recently has it become clear that that's because a lot of these are third-party sellers, right? And so knowledge about who you're actually, not just like what the service level is, like how fast it's going to come to me and who do I call if there's a problem, but who are they? Where are they, right? I mean, these are just basic ideas of transparency. And so in parallel with that, I just think you're seeing collaboration, and the sharing of information between the marketplaces and actual law enforcement, and even maybe among marketplaces themselves. Again, not antitrust considerations, right, or discussions about how we sort of, rig the system, but more we all have a vested interest in making sure that it's a safe and a fair ecosystem, and so you just see cooperation with law enforcement, but also between marketplaces, because ultimately you got to remember counterfeiting is a crime. That might seem obvious, but in the case of like who can do what to protect it, counterfeiting is a crime committed by criminals who again are exploiting cracks in the armor, right, of the marketplaces, and of the law, really. And so marketplaces, I think, are really on defense here. The government has a little more teeth, I think, when it comes to playing offense.
Yeah, and it's becoming, counterfeit is generally is a gigantic problem. It didn't start with online, but obviously, like many other problems, ballooned to gigantic proportions with the ease again of accessing target audience and the ease of setting up shop. I think the numbers are showing here on the slide, talking about, I've heard estimate that range between 500 billion to, as we see here, 630 billion dollars a year. And the danger of counterfeit is there's a multi levels to it, right? Obviously, there's the damage to the rights holder, right? We live in a society where we want to promote creativity and reward the people who work hard, invest money, and design something that is good, and not frustrate them, because then everybody would be like, okay, we're not going to do that. Because though somebody would come and rip us off and just sell without the proper investments. That's one. Second, there is the obviously danger to the buyer and the consumer. We talked a little bit about that. And that goes from frustration to, hey, I really wanted that bag, the original one, but I got a fake one, all the way to really poor people being exploited or deceived, in need of medicine.
Or endangered, Ron, not to interject, but endangered, right? So think of your toddler, your car seat, right? Your baby gear.
Absolutely.
That doesn't have to be actually compliant, right, to important safety standards because they're counterfeit, right? And just the real world example, you know what I mean? Yeah.
Exactly, and that's a obviously a very significant risk. We talked about that, about trust and so on. And we also need to understand who are the people who are engaged in these type of activities. These are oftentimes, criminal rings or even terrorist organizations. One of the primary ways for terrorist organization to get money, other than and drugs and so on, is by selling counterfeit. There is a very predominant, well-known case. It's a small example, but just to illustrate, the case, the Charlie Hebdo shooting in France, and the editorial was made by terrorists. It was in the French police report. In the last kind of paragraph, it said that the financing for the operation was by these guys selling counterfeit shoes. It was a counterfeit Nike. They were able to accumulate, I don't know, what was $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in order to purchase the weapon and then the other things that they needed in order to carry out the operation. So the danger that come out of counterfeit are multi-layered and are very severe. And we need to remember that it's not about the fake, watch or bag always. It goes much deeper, and the risk to the buyers and to the marketplace operation is significant.
Yeah, I might just interject there. I think you were also laying down, Ron, this notion of innovation, right? And how counterfeit essentially, cripples, innovation and actually impairs competition, right? Which ultimately impairs the power of the market. Maybe, I don't know if you want to unpack that a little further.
So, I mean, look, if everybody you're as anyone who's an entrepreneur, right? Who's trying to create something. It doesn't matter if you are doesn't matter if you're inventing something to help the world, or if you're an artist, and you go through a lot of effort in creating something that is novel, right, and that nobody thought of, and you worked through, you went through so much pain, or maybe investment, and you really got to the point where you did trial and error. You messed up a couple of times. You tried one thing, then you tried another thing, until finally you got to a place where there is something that is really, really good. And then comes another guy and says, right, this is good. I'll just copy it and sell it. if we're going to live in an environment that allows that, then the next person who's going to think about, going through the effort of creating something that would actually benefit the world, there's not going to be, there's nothing, they're not going to find anything in it for them, right? And so we want to make sure that we're rewarding novelty. I think it's a critical way for our society to advance, right? Otherwise, we'll just stay where we are, and that's never a good thing.
Yeah, which actually brings us back to speed, right? And I think if you think about sellers are looking at multiple marketplaces, right? And they are often sitting on product, right, that they need to move quickly. And so they're making, real decisions every day about where can I get up and running quickly? Not just like where can I get my organic search relevancy, up quickly, but like literally where can I get my product, on the platform quickly? And so one marketplace essentially sets the expectations on that, I think.
So with that in mind, then, what should companies look out for in the coming year with regards to marketplace risk? Ron?
Well, I think I think the trends that we've been seeing will continue to we'll continue to see them in 2023. One, there's a research that was conducted by McKinsey showing the ongoing trend of merchants moving more and more towards marketplaces versus having their own independent stores. We've seen the share of the total e-commerce share that went from roughly 25% in 2015. So marketplaces were holding about 25% of total e-commerce in 2015 to over 60% in 2023, and that's a very significant thing to notice. If you're operating in e-commerce and payments and so on, because what it means that the trend of merchants moving more and more into operating under a marketplace, under a platform, versus trying to operate their own sort of environment, will continue to grow, and ultimately, marketplaces are continuing to get more and more of the e-commerce share. So that's, speaking of all the different risks that we've sort of unpacked today, that's very significant because that's going to basically apply to the bulk part of all e-commerce. So I think that's an important thing to note. The other thing that we've just discussed, the counterfeit, because of the challenge that and the different difficulties and challenges that we unpack for the marketplace to tackle this problem, and because of the gigantic market and the ease of, as we said, accessing goods and accessing target audience, counterfeit is going to continue to be a dramatic issue going into 2023. And along with it, all the risks that we discussed that comes with counterfeit.
Yeah, that's again, we could talk about counterfeit all day, right? I think, and we keep coming back to speed and volume, but it's also important to remember that fundamentally the forces here are good in terms of I think the momentum and what we're seeing in terms of the rise of marketplaces, their ability to bring more and more product more quickly to more people and at better offers, right? Because the market dynamics because customer has increasing access to so many more offers, right? And ideally think of it like, when you're buying Tide, imagine, back in the 60s or 70s, that household shopper was able to be in, Walmart and Target and and Kroger and even before Amazon, and basically able to see competing offers, right? So it's sort of akin to that, which is you have multiple sellers making offers, ideally on the same item, which is great for market dynamics to drive price down and quality up, and increase access, which just again helps the customer, but it also could present a lot of challenges for, say, brand owners, right? And I think you definitely see brands and manufacturers, who are not necessarily keeping as tight watch and control over, their inventory, and when and how and where it might divert from like a channel directly to, a retailer where they have a 1P owned relationship and a JBP, and they've agreed on price and margin and everything else. And so essentially it's that sort of, where did it fall off the truck, right? Where did it get liquidated, and how is it coming back to a marketplace competing with me directly as the brand owner? Why am I competing with, reseller X, Y and Z on my own product, right? And so one of the really good trends we've seen in recent years, and I think let's continue to see more of it, is the ability of the brand owners to really protect their own intellectual property and their brand identity, right? And I think you see this appearing on a number of large marketplaces where, in some cases, in many, the brand doesn't even have to be selling actively on the platform. There's still a portal where they can go in, submit their credentials and gain, sort of be identified as the controlling brand owner. And, often with that will mean they're able to have control over the content on the listing, the product information that appears on the listing. And in most cases, what that'll mean is like X, Y, and Z are coming with an offer on that branded product. If the brand has, listed themselves as the accredited brand owner, in many cases, the listing will default to that content, that approved, content from the brand, which is great for the brand. It doesn't eliminate the sort of market forces that allowed resellers to bring the product, to the platform in the first place, but it ensures that, customer is always seeing what the brand wants them to see, right? And again, if you sort of take that as table stakes, then it gives the brand an opportunity to also then come onto the platform, right, and sell directly. And that's where they can really get into sort of, competing head to head on offer quality, price, fulfillment, et cetera. And if they put the pieces together correctly, it can be a great advantage for brand owners. And so I think it's not a coincidence, that we've increasingly seen brand owners more active, on marketplaces, which again is good for the customer because it doesn't diffuse the brand value, right, and the brand perception and identity. And again, it also creates more competition. And it probably also drives the brand to just pay a little more attention to, where their inventory flow is getting diverted. Or in some cases, it might lead to brands working directly with a reseller, that becomes an authorized distributor, as we see. And so it's super interesting. And I think it's good for the customer and it's good for the brand.
I don't want to, this is super interesting. I don't want to open a can of worms, but if this is going to be like a whole new, different webinar answer, so let me know. But what happens to your point with respect to the secondary market? Does this, everything that you said would apply to the secondary market as well?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for, my platform per se, but I think, yeah, the refurbished, right, restored market. I mean, obviously, some marketplaces like eBay, for example, that was their bread and butter from the beginning, right? But you definitely see a big push into restored and refurb, reused, gently used, et cetera. And I think more tools, right, from marketplaces in attributing quality, right? So in the same case of like an auto, like a certified pre-owned BMW, et cetera, seeing more of those types of sort of badges, right? Which again gets into compliance. Again, great for the customer. And yeah, for sure. I think we see that's also a space where brands can claim, and that brand identity, brand ownership on that new, can extend to cover, the same for the gently used, for sure. Yeah. Are you a purchaser of used items, refurbed, Ron?
No, I'm just trying to, because that's where it gets very kind of gray, right, and complicated, super complicated. When we're talking about, trying to address and putting the right controls over counterfeit, when you get this, these items that are actually authentic, but are coming through like a secondary market, that's where it gets super complicated to address, and there's a lot of interesting, thoughts on how to address them. But as we said, that's going to be on the follow-up webinar.
Yeah, and maybe just to land the plane with one other thought is, this is where product category has a lot to say as well, right? You're not going to see, to keep the Tide example, you're not going to see gently used Tide coming back to the secondary market, right?
Right.
In the same way that you might see, a used kitchen appliance, right? Maybe it's a used refrigerator, right, that contains Freon. And so you think about, like, there's certain categories that are just necessarily going to have a higher bar of safety, compliance, that when you think about, that's true not just on that first sale, but it also becomes even more true, right? And the safety checks and the quality, inspections that have to occur on those products. And you see a whole cottage industry rising to service that need, right? That sits in between, the compliance sectors of the marketplaces and the suppliers of those reefer products. So this is an Escher drawing that I think we could probably spend all day on, but super interesting.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm curious, how can organizations look to reduce the risk or manage the shifts that we expect to see in 2023? Ron?
Yeah, so as Matthew said, and I want to make sure that this point gets across correctly. Look, the technology is a fantastic thing. It's a great thing. It's a huge Enabler. It allows us, it really improves our way of living, from, as we said, being able to include people that were, or geographies that weren't necessarily able to get, access to certain things and so forth. So e-commerce and technology that supports e-commerce has improved our life, dramatically. Like with any type of technological evolution, it brings new challenges. And our test, as a society, is our ability to identify these challenges, these gaps that are being created, and try to put the right controls in place in order to allow for this great technology to thrive. This sometimes takes time. The internet was invented. The internet in general was started to operate on a global scale. I don't know, back in the 90s. It took us, maybe 20 years to understand the challenges around security and around privacy, and then start to address them. So that takes time. Having said that, the problems that we impact today are severe, and these are real challenges that can really cause a lot of damage and real harm. It can help support, illegal activity and terrorist activity and so forth. And so our ability to address these challenges is paramount. In order to face these challenges that created by technology, we can also use technology, right, to address some of these issues, especially as it pertains to speed and volume and coverage, and even the global nature and the regulatory complexity, all can be addressed by new technology that we have today, whether it's machine learning and AI that will allow the machine to identify products. How would you otherwise be able to go through billions, tens of billions of products a year if you're not going to apply, technology? You can apply technology to, as we said, to be able to preempt bad actors from operating, because they're being somehow identified or tagged in other places. And so the recommendation would be, arm the compliance and risk team in the organization with the right tools, to have the right capabilities to address these specific challenges that we outlined today.
Yeah, I think you reiterated a point from earlier, Ron, on this, that necessary friction internally in these companies, right? Which is like, understand the incentives of your different teams and how you might actually have teams incentivized, to take risk on the risk, right? In order to launch sellers, whereas you have a team that's solely devoted to, managing risk. And I think, Megan, to your question, how do you reduce or manage risk? I like that you used those two words, because I think often this conversation can begin with, how do I prevent marketplace risk, right? And I think it's important that everyone goes in sort of eyes wide open saying, and this might sound like a pretty, sort of thud of a statement, but I don't think there is any way to prevent marketplace risk if you are going to, sort of allow yourself access to what I think most partners, marketplaces, and vendors need in order to grow their business, right? Which is to say, it's a continuum, and it's a balancing act, right? Because the only way to totally, prevent the risk would be to operate a totally closed marketplace, where, you pick the winner as you set the rules, and it just becomes basically an extension of your 1P owned relationships. And that's not really a marketplace, as I think, as we all understand the term. It would remove all the liability, of course, but it's a huge disservice to the customer, right? Which means ultimately it can't compete, because it's not going to be able to get the volume, the breadth, the choice, the quality of the offers. It's not going to be able to fire and also be responsive, right, in real time to those demand spikes, right? You need to be able to, your customer needs to have access. Again, the reason for those 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 offers, right, on a given product is, again, like, those inventory levels are going to be fluctuating, among those sellers from time to time. And when an event, happens, whether it's a market fluctuation or, a societal thing like a COVID or a terrorist attack, whatever, it's like, you're going to see huge shifts. And so, like, that's where open marketplaces really do the customer service, right? Not just breadth and quality and, low prices, but also they react well, right? And they can react quickly, which basically prevents gaps, and it prevents dead ends for the customer. That's what happens from density and market dynamics. So when an open marketplace that behaves by those rules, but again, balancing that act, which we're talking about today, which is managing risk while keeping an open marketplace, right? Once the marketplace hits critical mass, right, a certain number of sellers and items, it really should drive itself. And I think that's what we saw with the birth of some of the largest marketplaces, in the past few years. So to land the plane, to thrive in an open market, you're just invariably going to face risk as the marketplace, right? And so it's important to sort of be honest and be true to that business choice, because that's a business choice, right? But there's a whole long tail of actions that have to stay true to make that business choice, congruent with protecting your customer. And what that, to sort of talk in a less fancy way, it means operating an open marketplace means you're going to have to very intentionally and very continually resource the teams that are going to be able to police and minimize, right, the actions of bad actors that are just necessarily going to come. So I think different businesses, different marketplaces and retailers will definitely find, their comfy spot, on that spectrum between risk and opportunity. But I think that's ultimately, where we land the plane. And what the question is, how much do I want to please customer? How much risk can I, agree to? And how much risk can I manage, both to make sure my company is not in a very dangerous spot in terms of legal liability, right? But also my customers protected. I think that's what we're talking about.
Excellent. Thank you. We are nearing the end of our time today. So just in the interest of time, I would like to just kind of dive into some of our questions that we've received throughout this presentation. So the first one we have here, when discussing the impact of counterfeits and the businesses profiting from the illegal wares, do regulators expect marketplaces to prevent this, or how have regulations shifted on this front? And I know that we touched on this a little bit, but Ron, what do you think?
You know, I can speak to it on general terms, and I can say that regulators absolutely, absolutely expecting businesses to act and address and not allow, the illegal sale of goods. And it's in all different levels. So, even if we're talking about car brand compliance, like if you're a marketplace and you want to, allow or operate over the car networks, the car network statement is very, very simple. If you can't do it, then, you're in the wrong business. So if you're going to operate, if you're going to be part of, if you're going to participate and be using our car network, you absolutely have to be able to detect and prevent this type of activity. And the amount of regulation from, there are different types of regulation that address these issues, customs and others. So I think the statement is coming from the regulator is very, very clear. However, it is still, as we've discussed, a pretty difficult problem to deal with and identify. And like in many other cases, it's a lot of cat and mouse. You're starting to put the controls. The bad actors find other ways to be able to conduct their business and so on. That's why the problem persists. But in terms of the clear message from the regulator, it's absolutely there.
Excellent, thank you. And I think we've got time to squeeze in one more question, so we'll end on this today. How does IP infringement play a role in all of this? Matthew?
Again, we could do a whole other series on this. I spoke about IP earlier, just in terms of its value to the brand. From a regulation perspective, regulatory body perspective, it's important for us to define, IP. So we're talking about patent law, right? Copyright law, et cetera. So my logo looks this way and I own it. It cannot be changed, right? My brand is called this. The design of my product is this, right? And no one else can make it, et cetera, unless it's gone off patent. So I think you look at that as the backdrop. That's essentially government's promise to companies, right? That if they invest the capital and the time to build something unique, it can't be stolen from them, right? And the government's going to create a market, essentially a place where people, can access that brand. And so sort of predictable demand. And so what counterfeiters will do is they basically blow the whole thing up, right? And so it's a blocker between the government's ability to, deliver on what companies need. And it's, of course, a disservice to the customer because they end up getting a bogus product, which can sometimes even be, unsafe. But I think we're seeing a lot of positive movements there. I think a weird sort of counter effect of COVID, is that a lot of companies closed, during COVID, and now a lot of new companies are forming because there's white space in the market. So, I think we should expect to see a lot of new brands being incorporated, a lot of new patents filed in the next year or two in the U.S. I think also you're seeing in other markets, for example, Europe, entire new bodies or partnerships, in the EU, specifically around patents. So I think there's a lot of work being done on the regulatory side to sort of spur the creation of patents, and which drives IP, right? And then from there, I think it becomes really on the marketplace to try to protect that as best we can, because ultimately, if marketplaces, get the reputation of being an unsafe place for brands, they will only and ever be a place for bad actors. And so I think, we owe it to the customer to make sure that doesn't happen.
Well said. Thank you so much. And that is all the time that we have today. A big thanks to Ron Teicher and Matthew Smith for their time, as well as EverC for sponsoring this conversation. Also, of course, a big thanks to our audience for joining us. As a reminder, this webinar will be available on demand and a link will be sent to you soon. Have a great day, everyone.